The continued persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church led by Metropolitan Arseniy remains widely unknown and unpublished in the West. Over 1,000 churches and monasteries have been stripped from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and handed over to the state-supported Orthodox Church of Ukraine, headed by Epifani Dumyanko. The faithful are forcibly evicted, often violently. There is ample video evidence of this available online. Clergy are frequently beaten, and not a few are imprisoned. I would like to present the case of Metropolitan Arseniy of the Svyatohirsk Lavra, which is particularly egregious in its disregard of legal proceedings, violation of his human rights, and blatant discrimination and prosecution of Metropolitan Arseniy for who he is, a well-respected and uncompromising bishop of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and not what he's done. Since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, Metropolitan Arseniy and the Brotherhood of the monastery he leads has given shelter to thousands of displaced Ukrainians. The monastery is close to the front lines. At one point, Russian forces were a mere 80 meters away from the monastery walls. Yet Metropolitan Arseniy has stayed at his post. On September 23, 2023, which was the eve of a major feast for the Lavra, during the evening service, Metropolitan Arseniy gave a homily which was recorded, as had been the practice for years. These homilies and other happenings at the monastery were published on social media accounts including YouTube, Telegram, and the Lavra's website. Metropolitan Arseniy began by recounting the words of St. Anthony the Great that, quote, "If a good deed is preceded or followed by temptation, then know that it was truly a good deed, because the enemy, the devil, will always attempt to stop or will try to harm those who do good works." End quote. Metropolitan Arseniy continues that shortly before the feast he was contacted by the Security Service of Ukraine and asked what and how the feast days were going to be held. Metropolitan Arseniy discussed with them their annual plans, and as he said, quote, "It seemed that we concluded our meetings peacefully and with mutual understanding." However, 3 checkpoints were set up today in Tatianovka. Tatianovka is one of the neighboring villages of the Lavra. One on the hill next to the monument of Artyoma. Here there's one post down below, and one at the end of Tatianovka at the entrance of the monastery. End quote. When the Metropolitan called the security services to ask what was going on, he received the response that it was just part of a routine document check. Yet, he says, not only were they checking people's documents, but they were recording pilgrims' personal and contact information and taking photos, and refusing to allow them to pass to attend services. Metropolitan Arseniy stated that this was a violation of their civic rights, and highlighted that no such document checks were being carried out for other religious events of other faiths, such as for the 32,000 Orthodox Jews that gathered in Uman for Rosh Hashanah that year. If one religious group is allowed to make pilgrimage, then other religious groups should have equal rights to make pilgrimage, end quote, Metropolitan Arseniy said. He reported that the security service responded that it was necessary to avoid large gatherings of people. But Metropolitan Arseniy continued in his homily, "Why then are there no restrictions at the post office or the markets in Slavyansk, which is the nearest metropolis?" Finally, the security services said to the Metropolitan that they were worried about the possibility of artillery and aerial attacks from the Russians, and therefore they weren't allowing people to enter the monastery. Metropolitan responded in his homily, "We sat here for 3 months being shelled before, and nobody asked how we were doing then. And besides that, if they were so sure about these possible attacks, why wasn't the residents of Slavyansk or Tatianovka warned about it? Why weren't we warned about it?" And he continues rhetorically, "They're worried about those coming to the Svyatohirsk Lavra, but they're not worried about us here." These checkpoints were scheduled by the security services to be in place only for these 2 days, the 2 days of the feast. Metropolitan Arseniy continued that, quote, "It's sad that we Orthodox Christians have become worse than criminals in our own country, in our own fatherland. Yet, this is a temptation, yes, but nonetheless it is also a feast. And we should not let this temptation consume our intention to pray. We came here to pray for those who were stopped from coming to the services, for those not able to be here, for our husbands and sons that are on the front lines. We came to pray for our country, for a quick end to the conflict and peace in our fatherland." End quote. It is worth noting that all this Metropolitan Arseniy said without the slightest anger or animosity. On April 24, 2024, Ukrainian security services declared that they suspected Metropolitan Arseniy of dissemination of information about the movement, actions, or location of the armed forces of Ukraine with the possibility of their identification on the ground. Metropolitan Arseniy was arrested. On the next day, April 25th, the court ruled that he should be detained in a pretrial detention facility, prison, without the possibility of bail. A Ukrainian journalist learned that the foundation of these accusations was the video of Metropolitan Arseniy's homily, in which he allegedly, quote, revealed discreetly the locations of military troops, end quote. The journalist's source sarcastically noted, quote, according to the SBU's version, SBU is the Ukrainian security services, this is how Russian intelligence collects data on targets for artillery. After all, it's not like the Russians have satellite reconnaissance and drones, end quote. The journalist himself wrote, quote, to call these 10 seconds of a public homily with absolutely non-distinct locations and without accurate addresses, a, quote, veiled transmission of armed forces of Ukraine positions, end quote, considering that these are not even permanent military posts, but specifically created temporary checkpoints, this requires a rich imagination and a sick conscience, end quote. This is all the more true, being that the video was published on the morning of the 25th, when the checkpoints would have been disbanded already according to the actionable intelligence related by Metropolitan Arseniy in the video. He had said that the checkpoints were scheduled for the 23rd and the 24th only, and, quote, I even think that tomorrow, the 24th, after lunch, they won't be checking people's documents, end quote. He was pointing out that this is just, it's an example of the repression of the church by the government. There wasn't actually any necessity for checking people's documents. As a reminder, this video, like hundreds before and after it, was and still is publicly available online. Nonetheless, these accusations are the basis of Metropolitan Arseniy's continued pretrial detention in prison, illegally according to Ukrainian law, for 515 days as of November 13th, 2025. Every request to allow him to be released on bail was denied, notwithstanding nearly a dozen Ukrainian government officials willing to take responsibility for his custody on bail upon themselves. At the end of September 2025, due to his declining health and after many requests, the court finally allowed Metropolitan Arseniy to undergo a medical examination. The doctors established that he is in need of an emergency surgery on his heart. The court denied the request for him to be transferred to a different city to receive the necessary medical attention. The court stated that they were concerned that Metropolitan Arseniy might abscond out of the country and avoid prosecution. On October 23rd, Metropolitan Arseniy's legal counsel were granted their oft-repeated request for bail. It was set at 1,514,000 hryvnia, or approximately $36,000. On October 27th, that bail was paid, and on October 28th, the Metropolitan was released from the detention facility. But he was met right outside the door by security service personnel and was promptly arrested again on new charges. Once again, the cycle started of deciding whether Metropolitan Arseniy should be detained in prison or released on bail for these new charges. Throughout these proceedings, from October 29th to November 3rd, Metropolitan Arseniy was taken to the hospital multiple times with dangerously high blood pressure. Each time, he was quickly returned to the court to continue the proceedings. During his final trip to the hospital, his blood pressure was 200/110. The doctors decided to admit him until the morning in order to do some analysis. The security service personnel, there's even a photo of the container that they gave him for those analyses for the next day. But the security service personnel escorting the Metropolitan informed the doctor that if he were to admit Metropolitan Arseniy, he should consider himself fired. Unfortunately, the doctor did not admit him, but signed his release from the hospital as being stable. Upon returning to the court proceedings in a visibly distressed condition, it was ruled that he should be returned to the pretrial detention facility until December 10th, when most likely it will be extended, as it's been extended for 17 months now. The official accusation of the state prosecutor published on the government website of the Office of the Prosecutor General is, quote, suspicion of justification, recognition as lawful, or denial of the armed aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine and glorification of its participants, end quote. Particularly in May and June of 2022, Metropolitan Arseniy, during public speeches, denied Russia's armed aggression and accused the armed forces of Ukraine of the deaths of clergy and a nun, as well as the destruction of church buildings. There were no examples of these speeches presented, although, as stated previously, Metropolitan Arseniy's homilies are publicly available dating back 7 years. Even if this was true, it seems disproportionate to risk his life by detaining him in prison because of a statement he made, especially in light of the right to freedom of speech established in Article 34 of the Ukrainian Constitution. But it should be reiterated that no examples have yet to be presented to establish this suspicion of disinformation present in Metropolitan Arseniy's homilies. Ukrainian security forces are pushing Metropolitan Arseniy to sign an agreement so that he can be used in a prisoner exchange. It is unclear whether this agreement includes a confession of guilt of collaborating with the Russian forces or not. Metropolitan Arseniy said in his closing defense speech on November 3rd, quote, "They came to me and said, sign the agreement, we'll exchange you. But I don't want that. I want to stay here. My flock is here. My brothers are here. My sisters, my spiritual children are here. My boys from the armed forces of Ukraine who have never renounced me, and I will never renounce them because they are mine. They are here." It seems clear, end quote. It seems clear that if he were to agree to this exchange, it would be used against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as proof of their connection to Moscow, and would be the justification of more repression and seizures of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church's assets, and possibly would set a dangerous precedent for further arrests and forced agreements. Every UOC clergy would become a pawn to be exchanged. Metropolitan Arseniy has no intention of doing this because he maintains his innocence in the case. He continues, quote, "I do not admit guilt even in the slightest because there is none. Everything is fabricated. Everything is imagined. I had no intention of fleeing anywhere, nor do I intend to, as the prosecution believes. Where would I run to in my condition, especially since I don't have any documents on me? And I run away to whom? Who needs me? The people who need me are here. I have been a priest in Ukraine for 33 years, 30 of which I have been the superior of the Svyatohirsk Lavra. If I am an enemy of Ukraine, how is it that 10 members of the Verkhovna Rada vouch for me? If I am an enemy of Ukraine, why do so many of our soldiers support me? Sashko is here. He is the only one here, but there are many of our soldiers who stand with me. If we were to summon all the soldiers who came to our Lavra and said that if it weren't for Vladika, that being Metropolitan Arseniy himself, they would have gone crazy. If we were to summon them to gather here, you wouldn't have enough benches, halls, or corridors to fit them. Your Honor, I ask you very much to allow me to go away from here, not to the pretrial detention center, because I will not be able to survive it, but to Kiev to undergo treatment there." End quote. As stated previously, this request was denied by the court, and Vladika Arseniy was indeed sent back to the pretrial detention facility. I have a few quotes here from the GULAG Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. They are found in the first chapters that describe arrest and interrogation by the Soviet secret police. Quote, "The theoretical view of the suspect's guilt was incidentally quite elastic from the very beginning. They tell us that the creation of fabricated cases began back in the early years of the organs. Lists of names prepared up above, or an initial suspicion, were all that was needed to bring about the arrest of the suspect, followed by the inevitable formal charge. And so, they take you from a military hospital with a temperature of 102, and the doctor will not raise a peep about your arrest, just let him try. They'll take you right off the operating table, as they took Vorobyov, a school inspector in 1936, in the middle of an operation for a stomach ulcer, and drag you off to a cell as they did him, half alive and all bloody. Regarding the time in detention, the time allotted for investigation was not used to unravel the crime, but 95 cases out of 100 to exhaust, wear down, weaken, or render helpless the defendant, so that he would want it to end at any cost. In the spring of 1922, the Extraordinary Commission for Struggle Against Counter-Revolution, Sabotage, and Speculation, the CZEKA, which is the Czerwyczajna Komisja, a form of martial law, decided to intervene in church affairs. It was called to carry out a church revolution, to remove the existing leadership and replace it with one which would only have one ear turned to heaven and the other to the Lubyanka. The so-called living church people seemed to go along with this plan, but without outside help, they could not gain control of the church apparatus. For this reason, the Patriarch Tikhon was arrested and 2 resounding trials were held, followed by the execution in Moscow of those who had published the Patriarch's appeal, and in Petrograd of the Metropolitan Veniamin, who had attempted to hinder the transfer of ecclesiastical power to the living church group. Here and there in the provincial centers, and even further down in the administrative districts, metropolitans and bishops were arrested, and, as always, in the wake of the big fish, followed shoals of smaller fry, archpriests, monks, and deacons. These arrests were not even reported in the press. They also arrested those who refused to swear to support the living church's renewal movement. This is often called the renovationist movement." End quote. Following the reading of the verdict, Metropolitan Arseniy spoke to those who came to him for support. He said, "Do not think that today we have been defeated. No, why have we not been defeated? Because we have remained with God and with a clear conscience. That is our greatest victory. Our conscience is pure." Vladika even began justifying the security service personnel that were detaining him. He said, "Do you think that it was easy for the boys from SBU, the Служба безпеки Украины, which is the security services? They're living souls too, don't blame them. This is their job. I always called them the service of the God of Ukraine, Служба Божья Украины, which would keep the acronym the same, the letters for the acronym the same. You have already expressed your anger," the Metropolitan continued. "You said something. Well, we forgive everyone on Forgiveness Sunday, don't we? Not only the righteous, but the entire world, and that means them too. So today you should apologize to the guys if you've said something in your hearts. Our God is the God of love and justice. You know, in the grave of justice, love is buried. But we are not waiting for justice in this world, but for love." End quote. We ask that you, the viewers, pray for the strength and health of the servant of God, Metropolitan Arseniy, and those that have the power to intervene in the case of Metropolitan Arseniy do so before it's too late.